Spring came gently to the roads of Friar. The wind moved through the grass in long silver waves, and the hills rolled toward the north as if the land itself had grown tired of walls and wished only to lie down. Magnolia walked with her usual calm, her hands folded behind her back, her steps even, her eyes always forward. John of Come walked beside her with less grace and more curiosity, tapping stones with his boot, snapping seed heads from weeds, and occasionally casting little sparks from his fingers into the roadside brush just to see how quickly they died. Ahead of them, vast and stern against the sky, stood the mountain of Reaper Lance Altar. It rose from the earth like judgment made stone. John looked up at it for a long while. There it is. Magnolia smiled faintly. There it is. They kept walking. The mountain remained ahead, then beside them, then slightly behind as the road bent. Neither turned toward the path that climbed to the altar. After a while, John said, "One supposes we ought to have a speech prepared." For what? For deciding not to save the world. Magnolia let out the softest laugh. Would that require a speech? I think all neglected duties improve under narration. She tilted her head. Then narrate? John cleared his throat and raised a hand as if addressing a crowd. Citizens of Solunus, after measured thought, poor planning, insufficient snacks, and a complete absence of emotional investment, we have decided not to ascend the holy mountain today. Magnolia nodded. A fair decree. He glanced sideways at her. You do not wish to go either. No? Because of preparation? That would be a respectable answer. John smiled. And the true one? Magnolia looked toward the mountain. I do not feel called to save anything. John gave a satisfied hum. Good. I was worried you might recover. She turned to him. Recover? Yes, into one of those noble moods. Very inconvenient things, noble moods. They spoil good weather. Magnolia's expression remained light, but her voice lowered a little. Do you think it wrong not to care? John considered. No, only unusual if said aloud. That pleased her. They walked on. Below the mountain were travellers, pilgrims, and supply beasts, men with ash on their brows, women carrying relic charms, adventurers boasting loudly before the climb. They looked at John and Magnolia with the passing interest reserved for strangers who did not seem desperate enough to matter. John watched them with mild fascination. Look at them, he said. All that earnestness. It must be exhausting. They need the altar to mean something, Magnolia replied. And you? I prefer things that mean several things at once. He laughed. Yes, that is exactly what worries me about you. She gave him a warm look, one that would have comforted almost anyone else. And what worries me about you is that nothing worries you for very long. That is a strength. That is how fires begin. John looked out over the fields. When in doubt, fire a soul pyra. Magnolia smiled despite herself. That is not a philosophy. It is, if repeated. They left the site of the altar by afternoon and followed an older road westward. A ruined shrine stood near a stream. They rested there and ate preserved fruit and hard bread while swallows cut low through the air. John lay back against the stone and folded his hands over his chest. Tell me, he said, when Bam Bam found Awum's temple, do you suppose he knew what he meant to do? Magnolia looked across the stream. No. You say that with confidence. Corruption rarely begins as confession. It begins as invitation. John smiled at that. That is a very polished thought. It is true. Do you think he loved her in his way? Magnolia was quiet for a moment. Perhaps that may have made it easier. John sat up a little. And if Awam's temple still stands, and if it holds anything from that moment, would you wish to see it? Magnolia did not answer at once. The stream went on talking to itself. At last she said, "Yes." He seemed unsurprised. "Good, because I think that is where the better story lies." The better story than what? Than climbing mountains for priests? She watched him carefully then. John's manner was easy, almost playful, but he had a habit she had begun to notice. He would mention a thing only lightly the first time. A second time he would make it sound harmless. By the third, it had already entered the road. "And how?" she asked. "Do you propose we find a temple tied to the Forbidden Islands?" John grinned. "By speaking to people who read too much. Waka Academy." Waka Academy. She turned back toward the west, where far beyond sight lay Gobwa and the brittle towers and vine-work halls of scholars who collected impossible questions like children collected stones. "The ocean vortex," Magnolia said, "the one that bars passage to the islands." "Exactly so." "And you believe Waka keeps records on it?" "I believe Waka keeps records on everything no sensible person should preserve." That evening the sky went gold, then red, then the pale grey blue that comes before true dark. They made camp beneath an old tree whose roots had broken apart a traveller's marker long ago. John built the fire with practised ease. Magnolia watched the flames settle into shape. It might have looked peaceful to anyone passing by. Two travellers at ease, bread warming on a flat stone, firelight in the grass, wind in the branches. But their peace had already shifted. The mountain they had declined still stood behind them. The world remained in danger, as worlds do. Yet what interested them now was not duty, nor salvation, nor the burden of the cycle. It was Awam's temple. It was the island no one should reach. It was the pleasure of moving towards something forbidden simply because it was there. John handed Magnolia a piece of warmed bread. "Do you know," he said, "I think I like you better away from heroic settings." Magnolia accepted it. "And I think I like you better when the world asks nothing of you." He leaned back and looked into the fire. "Then we are both improving." She smiled. Above them the stars appeared one by one, cold and far, while below, on the road that did not lead to the altar, two travellers quietly chose a different kind of ruin. The farther they went from Reaper Lance altar, the lighter John seemed to become. Some men grew serious when leaving behind duty. John grew cheerful. He whistled as they crossed the lowlands. He commented on birds with the authority of a man who did not know their names and did not care. He stopped twice to peer at odd stones, once because he thought one resembled a sleeping king, and once because he thought another would be satisfying to throw into a pond. Magnolia, for her part, seemed no less composed than before, but something in her had loosened. She spoke more readily now, not more honestly, perhaps, but more often. The silences between them were no longer watchful. They were companionable. By the fourth day the air changed. Gobua announced itself before it appeared. The wind carried a sharper taste, green and cold at once. Vines began appearing where they should not have been. Stone markers wore thin root veins across their faces. Trees leaned in ways that suggested decision rather than growth. "This place always feels," John said, "as though a library and a swamp had been told to compromise." Magnolia smiled. "You say that fondly?" "I do. It is one of the few lands that still feels unfinished." "All lands are unfinished." "Yes," he said, "but Gobua admits it." They reached Wakaku near dusk. She had made camp beside a split rise of stone where roots climbed upward rather than down. Her baggage was arranged in the careful disorder common to scholars: scroll tubes wrapped in oilcloth, cases of notes, botanical samples hanging to dry, a kettle blackened by repeated forgetfulness. 3 books left open face down in the dirt, each apparently important enough to bring and not important enough to protect. Wakaku herself was seated on a crate, muttering at a page while chewing something bitter. She looked up as they approached and squinted. Then she groaned. "Oh no!" John spread her hands. "Scholar, friend, voice of reason. I am none of those things to you." "Then perhaps host." Wakaku pointed at him. "The last time I helped you, you almost burned down the Hearth Tavern." John nodded. "I couldn't help it. You were cold to me." "Because I thought you weren't a scholar." "I was." "You tried to set a building on fire." "I set a small amount of it on fire." Wakaku turned to Magnolia as though appealing to a higher court. "And you." Magnolia inclined her head. "Good evening, Wakaku." "You also have the look of a problem." "That is unkind." "It is accurate." Still, she let them sit. Wakaku had the weakness of many scholars. If offered the chance to speak at length about an obscure subject, she could be made to forgive almost anything. They shared his fire. Magnolia listened with apparent patience while Wakaku explained the latest theory on stable manner behavior in autonomous Slimus communities. John listened just enough to interrupt at exactly the wrong times. At length, when tea had been poured and the night had softened around them, Magnolia asked, "Do Waka's archives hold anything on the ocean vortex around the Forbidden Islands?" Wakaku went still. Not dramatically, only enough for a careful observer to notice. John noticed. "Ah," he said, pleased, "so the fish does know the hook." Wakaku frowned. "Why?" Magnolia answered calmly. "Curiosity." "No." "Research, then." "Also no." John leaned in. "You wound us. We have come all this way with innocent expressions prepared." "There is no innocent reason to ask about the vortex." "That is what makes it interesting," John said. Wakaku rubbed at his face. "Yes, Waka has records. No, I do not like that I know the ones you mean. And no, I will not help you steal them." Magnolia spoke gently. "We did not ask to steal anything." Wakaku narrowed her eyes. "You may be worse." John brightened. "Thank you." Wakaku ignored him. "There is an old archive text, common enough among advanced students, which is itself a poor reflection on institutional judgment. It concerns current behavior, layered mana pressure, and the shaping of passage through hostile water formations. Most students read it because they think it sounds romantic. They stop reading when it becomes mathematics." John looked delighted. "So there is a book?" "There is. And it would help someone reach the Forbidden Islands?" "In theory." "In practice?" "In practice, most people are not worth the sea's effort to drown properly." John gave a satisfied sigh. "Scholars, even your warnings are invitations." Wakaku pointed at him again. "You are not going to the islands." John glanced at Magnolia. "What do you think?" "I think," Magnolia said, "that the sea is often treated like law simply because it is large." Wakaku stared at her. "That is an alarming sentence." "Is it false?" "No," she said. "That is why it is alarming." The fire cracked between them. John asked, "Would the archive allow visitors to consult the text?" "Under supervision, yes." "Anyone?" "Technically." "Marvelous. It is not marvelous." "It is to us." Wakaku looked from one to the other and understood, perhaps too late, that she had already moved them one step closer to what they wanted. She sank slightly where she sat. "I should not have answered." John gave her an almost sympathetic look. "But you did. That is the burden of being useful." Later, when the fire had lowered and the conversation drifted elsewhere, the night grew strangely pleasant. Wakaku spoke of the failures of Waka Academy with the fondness reserved for one's own disappointing family. Magnolia asked questions about archive protocols, old sections of the academy, damaged catalogues, and the difference between public reading chambers and restricted vaults. John kept the mood light, tossing in jokes, observations, and the occasional absurd comparison. He made a bad meal sound cheerful. He made old roads sound adventurous. He made delay feel like design. That was one of his gifts. Even his drift had direction. As the hour deepened, Wakaku yawned, muttered something about early light, and finally crawled beneath a heavy blanket beside his baggage. Magnolia rested against a root-curved stone, eyes half-lidded. John lay back with his hands under his head, looking up through the branches. For a while neither spoke. Then Magnolia said quietly, "You enjoy this." "The road?" "This. Influence without effort. Doors opening because people answer you." John smiled at the sky. "I enjoy motion." "That is not the same thing." "No," he said, "but it sounds better." Magnolia watched him. "And Arwum's temple, is that also only motion?" At this, John was quiet longer than usual. The night insects carried on around them. Somewhere beyond sight, water moved through roots. At last he said, "Have you ever noticed how peace makes people sentimental? They begin to think the world has settled because it has grown quiet. They confuse pause with cure." "And that troubles you?" "It bores me." His tone was light. Too light. Magnolia understood that. "And so," she asked, "you seek old wounds?" "No, only interesting ones." She considered him. The fire gave a low hiss as sap caught in one of the logs. "You know," Magnolia said, "for all your playfulness, you do believe in pressure." "Of course. You think people reveal themselves best under it." John turned his head toward her, smiling. "Do they not?" She returned the smile. "Yes." That answer pleased him. He closed his eyes then, or seemed to. Magnolia looked once toward Wakaku, already asleep beside her baggage, and once toward John, who appeared as relaxed as a man by a garden wall. But the road had changed again. They were no longer merely traveling toward knowledge. Now they were traveling with someone who possessed it. And in the stillness of that camp, among notes and roots and sleeping scholarship, the night waited for whim to become action. The night in Gobua was never fully dark. The vines held a dim green memory in their veins. and the roots that hung from the stones gave off a pale, wet shine that made even silence seem observed. Wakaku snored lightly under her blanket, one arm flung over a satchel of books, as though knowledge might wander off, if not pinned down. Magnolia had not slept. She sat with her back to the stone and watched the fire reduce itself. John, across from her, seemed to sleep as easily as any child in peacetime, one boot still on, one boot off, his hand resting loosely on his chest. Then, with no warning, he opened one eye. "You are awake," Magnolia said. "So are you." "I was under the impression you were dreaming." "I was deciding." He sat up slowly and looked toward Wakaku's baggage. There was nothing furtive in the motion. That was what made it unsettling. He did not creep. He did not hesitate. He rose as though fetching another piece of firewood, stepped around the sleeping scholar, and crouched by the stacked satchels. Magnolia watched. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Research. That is not your profession." "It may be tonight." He opened one flap, then another. Papers, dried roots, notes bound in twine, a small instrument of brass and vine fibre, 3 sealed tubes, a wrapped packet that smelled sharply medicinal. He searched without urgency. It was that lack of urgency which revealed the truth. This was not panic, nor greed, nor necessity. It was appetite without hunger, a desire for interruption. At last, his fingers closed on a narrow scroll case made not of bark or wood, but of lacquered black shell. It was bound with a pale thread marked by tiny knots of warding. John held it up. Magnolia straightened slightly. "That does not look academic." "No," John said softly. "It looks promising." He loosened the thread. Inside was a scroll, unlike the others. The script across it did not rest evenly. It seemed to pull inward, as if the writing preferred not to line. The marks were precise, experimental, and ugly in the way only deliberate magic could be ugly. At the margin, in smaller notation, were several cautionary comments in Wakaku's hand, some crossed out, some rewritten. One sentence remained untouched. "Tether curse. Stability unresolved. No reversal known." John read it twice. Magnolia rose and came beside him. The two stood over the scholar's things with the air of travellers examining a map. "What is it?" she asked, though she had already seen enough to know. He handed it to her. She read the line, then the next. Then the body of the work faster than most would think possible. "A curse," she said. "Experimental, dense binding. It appears to attach a target's being to an imposed condition." John leaned against a rock. "Can it be broken?" "Not according to this." "Can it be cast?" She looked at him then. "Yes." Wakaku slept on. The small fire shifted. John watched Magnolia's face with keen interest, not because he needed her to explain the scroll, but because he wanted to see what shape the thought would take in her. "A terrible thing," he said. "Yes. And yet you are curious." She looked back down at the spell. "Yes." He nodded as if that were the expected and proper answer. For a few moments neither spoke. The curse remained between them, written by a mind that had crossed from theory into trespass and then lacked the courage, or perhaps the time, to destroy the result. Magnolia traced one notation lightly with her thumb, not enough to activate anything, only enough to feel the discipline of its shape. Why would Wakaku keep this? Because scholars mistake record-keeping for innocence. She may have meant to bury it. John shrugged. He did not. Magnolia rolled the scroll closed. The road had been relaxed for so long. Their talks had been pleasant, their diversions mild, their pursuit of Awam's temple still lived in the realm of future intention. But now something else had arrived, something immediate, something irreversible. John looked out into the dark beyond the camp. There are Slimus in this region, yes? Magnolia did not answer. He continued very lightly. A random one would do. At that, she turned to him fully. You are serious? Are you surprised? No. That answer pleased him too much. The silence between them sharpened, not tense, not moral, merely exact. John's voice remained gentle. Do you know what peace produces, Magnolia? Softness, boredom. She tilted her head. You speak as though boredom were a force of corruption. It often is. He smiled at the trees. In war, people excuse cruelty by necessity. In peace, one discovers who reaches for it without being asked. Magnolia studied him. He had no fury in him, no cause, no injury demanding answer. He was not avenging anything. He was not desperate. He simply wanted something to happen, and because he wanted it, he had made the thing available. What would this prove? Magnolia asked. John considered. Very little. She waited. That is partly why it interests me. Her gaze did not leave him. You would ruin a life for an evening's movement. Ruin is such a loaded word. It is the accurate one. Then yes. Magnolia looked again at the scroll. For all her manipulations, for all her smooth turns of mind and quiet appetite for order through influence, this was different. Not because it was worse than what lay in her nature, but because it was cruder, smaller, more casual, less like destiny, more like choice. And in that she found, to her own discomfort, a kind of freedom. Would you ask me to do it? She said. John smiled softly. No, I would only say that if one is handed a door, it is interesting to know what lies behind it. That was how he did it. Never command, never push hard enough to be seen pushing. He merely arranged the weight of a thing and let it lean. A movement in the brush broke the moment. Not far from the camp, a Slimus drifted into the clearing edge, small, pale blue, barely more than a rounded body with soft, blinking eyes. It moved with the harmless uncertainty common to stable wild Slimus, drawn perhaps by warmth, perhaps by ambient mana. It did not know it had entered a story. John looked at Magnolia. Magnolia looked at the Slimus. The creature gave a faint bubbling sound and paused near a root, catching firelight across its surface. John said quietly, There. Magnolia exhaled once. Then she stepped forward. The casting was not dramatic, no thunder, no great flare. The scroll unfurled in her hand, and the script rose from it in thin, hooked strands of light, pale at first, then darkening at the edges. The Slimus recoiled too late. The curse wrapped around it, passed through it, tightened and fixed. The sound it made then was not loud. That was the worst part. A confused, wet, broken sound, as if its own shape had become wrong to itself. The light collapsed. The scroll emptied. The Slimus spasmed once, then again, then drew inward unnaturally, its body pulled by a bond that had no place in the natural laws governing its kind. Its movement became unstable. Its form trembled, as if tethered to pain just beyond sight. Magnolia stood very still. John watched with calm fascination. So, he said quietly, it works. The Slimus tried to move and failed in a way that suggested permanent change. Wakaku woke to the sound. He sat upright, saw the empty scroll in Magnolia's hand, the afflicted Slimus writhing near the root, and for one long second understood everything. "No," she said. Then louder, with horror breaking through her, "No!" She lunged for the creature first, dropping to his knees beside it, hands shaking as he tried to read the curse's visible distortions. "What did you do?" she demanded. John answered plainly, "We tested something." Wakaku turned. "You tested it?" Magnolia did not speak. Wakaku looked from one to the other and saw with increasing disbelief that neither appeared remorseful enough to be accidental. "You stupid, rotten—" She stopped, choking on rage. "Do you know what that is? Do you know what you have done?" "Yes," Magnolia said. Wakaku stared at her. "And you still did it?" John gave a small shrug. She was curious. Wakaku rose then, more dangerous for being a scholar. In panic, she seized the nearest prepared focus from her baggage, a twisted rod of living vine tipped with a stone lens, and drove a burst of force toward them. Magnolia deflected it. John answered immediately, almost happily. "When in doubt," he said, raising a hand, "fire a Solpyra." The fireball struck Wakaku's ward, shattered it, and threw her back through her own camp, scattering notes, bundles, and ash. She hit the ground hard and coughed, stunned. Magnolia stepped forward and, with a brief movement of her hand, bound her arms in a constricting ring of force before she could recover. The cursed Slimus dragged itself in a crooked half-circle, emitting those small, ruined sounds. Wakaku saw it and nearly wept. "You leave that scroll," she said hoarsely. "You leave everything. You do not walk away from this." John looked around at the wrecked camp as though evaluating a disappointing inn. "I think," he said, "we do." Magnolia watched Wakaku on the ground. There was anger in her, grief too, but little immediate threat now. She was beaten, winded, and trapped. The scholar and the creature lay together in the dirt like a lesson no one had asked for. She might have undone the binding on her. She did not. Instead, she turned away. John was already gathering his things. Wakaku's voice came raw through the clearing. "There is no cure." Magnolia paused, but only for a moment. "I know," she said. Then she and John left her there. Behind them, under the pale green not dark of Gobwa, Wakaku struggled against the force binding her arms while the tether-cursed Slimus writhed beside her ruined camp. Ahead of them lay Waka Academy, and neither traveller looked back for long. Morning in Gobwa came softly. Mist clung low among the roots and lifted in torn ribbons from the stones. Somewhere behind them, though no longer visible, lay Wakaku's camp, the broken remains of her notes, the scholar herself, and the cursed Slimus, whose suffering had already begun to fold into distance. John walked with a spring in his step. That, more than anything, marked the change. He was not shaken, not reflective, not defensive. He was refreshed. Magnolia noticed it at once. "You seem well rested," she said. "I am." "That is unfortunate." John smiled. "Only if one expected remorse to improve me." They followed a ridge path where the roots formed natural steps. On one side, the ground dropped into a ravine full of pale moss and slow-moving vapor. On the other rose walls of vine-wrapped stone, old as silence. For a while they said nothing. The silence between them was not strained. They had crossed some threshold in the night, and now they walked on its far side with the ease of those who know they cannot honestly return to where they were. At last, Magnolia said, "You arranged that." John looked mildly offended. "Arranged is such an active word." "You found the scroll." "Yes. You suggested a target." "I observed one." "You placed the decision in my hand so that it would still be mine." John glanced at her and smiled. "And was it not?" She did not answer at once. "No," she said at last, "it was." That seemed to satisfy him. The path narrowed. They moved single file for a stretch, then emerged into a high open shelf where thin white flowers had grown between cracks in the rock. The wind passed through them without scent. Magnolia looked out over the trees below. "Do you know," she said, "what is strange?" "Many things. I expected to feel less clear. And instead—" "More?" John nodded, as though discussing the weather. "Yes, action often simplifies." "It should not have." "But it did." She looked at her own hand for a moment, the same hand that had cast the curse. "I thought power would feel heavy when used so needlessly." And yet, it felt exact. John gave a soft laugh. "Magnolia, that is because you are built for conviction. You merely prefer refined forms of it." She turned back to him. "And you? What are you built for?" He spread his hands. "Movement, interference, fire, good company. Not goodness. No, not purpose. Only selected ones." They resumed walking. The road to Waka Academy was marked by old learning posts, each carved with brittle phrases about patience, method, and caution. Some had fallen over. John read one aloud in a solemn tone. "To know the current, one must not strike the river." He looked at Magnolia. "Bad advice." She smiled. "It depends on your goals." "Oh, my goals are terrible for rivers." That pulled a real laugh from her. There it was again, that strange ease between them. On the surface they sounded almost bright, two travellers passing the time, a naturalist and an elf, perhaps, one lightly irreverent, the other gracefully severe. Their tones remained jolly, their observations measured, their conversation full of ideas rather than confessions. And all the while their moral positions shifted beneath the words. That was the danger of them together. Magnolia made cruelty sound principled. John made it sound harmless. Combined, they made it easy. By midday, they stopped near a spring threaded through stone. John knelt to drink and then sat back on his heels, looking pleased with life. "Wakaku will hate us forever," he said. "Yes." "She will be correct." "Yes." "And yet we proceed." Magnolia folded herself onto a flat stone. "Of course." "Why of course?" She considered. "Because whatever line there was, we crossed it without resistance." John listened. "Because the Slimus was random," she continued. "That is what matters. Not necessity, not revenge, not some grand design, only whim with consequences." An excellent phrase. It is not praise. It should be. Magnolia looked at him steadily. "You truly believe disorder is preferable to peace?" "No, I believe peace without strain rots the mind." "That is not the same thing." "It is close enough for human use." She dipped her fingers into the spring, watching the water bend around them. "And I," she said, "believe order is best when freely chosen." John smiled. "Do you?" She returned the smile, but there was less warmth in it than before. "No, I believe order is easiest when people do not notice it entering." He laughed outright. "There you are." She looked toward the north, and there you are as well, not chaotic by accident. You choose disruption because stillness insults you. I do dislike stagnation. You dislike innocence, only when it is proud of itself. The spring went on flowing. A small bird landed nearby, then fled when John flicked a spark toward it. He had no intention of hitting it. The gesture was pure instinct, motion-seeking response. Magnolia noticed that too. "You are changing," she said. "So are you." "I know." That was perhaps the darkest part of the road. Not that they changed, but that both of them could see it clearly and found no reason to stop. By late afternoon, the first outer structures of Waka Academy came into view. They appeared less like buildings than ideas held together by stubbornness. Towers wrapped in living vine, hanging walkways, pods suspended from root bridges, platforms grown from layered bark and reinforced with frost-white resin. Sections had clearly collapsed before and been grown back differently, as if the academy revised itself with every wound. John looked at it with deep approval. "Wonderful! It looks unstable." "It is full of people who think instability is research." "My favorite kind." Magnolia stood beside him at the ridge, both of them looking down at the place that held the archive text they wanted, the methods for crossing the ocean vortex, and perhaps the next door John would quietly open. Behind them lay Reaper Lance, ignored. Behind them also lay a scholar and a cursed creature abandoned to consequence. Ahead lay Waka. Beyond Waka, the Forbidden Islands. Beyond that, perhaps Awam's temple itself. John slipped his hands into his pockets and smiled into the wind. "Do you think," he asked, "we have become worse?" Magnolia's gaze remained fixed on the academy. Yes, he seemed pleased by the honesty of it. "And do you mind?" A pause. Then, softly, almost thoughtfully, she answered, "Less than I should." John nodded. "Good." They started down toward the academy together. Not hurried, not ashamed, not triumphant, simply comfortable. As though this, too, were only a pleasant continuation of the road. And somewhere far behind them, in a wrecked little camp under the green-lit dark of Gobua, the first true consequence of their companionship was still alive and suffering. They did not speak of it again, not because they had forgotten, because they had not.